was still breathing, still walking, still cooking my own meals when I learned my daughter-in-law had already planned my funeral. She had decided who would get my jewelry, my savings, even my house, as if I were already gone. I didn't scream or confront her. I smiled, stayed quiet, and let them believe I knew nothing. Because while they were dividing my life, I was rewriting my legacy. Before I begin, if you've ever lived through betrayal that came wrapped in smiles and polite voices, please like this video, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel. Your stories remind others they're not alone. I never thought I'd be the kind of woman people whispered about while I was still standing in the next room. I was 68 years old then, widowed for nearly a decade, living in the same modest but well-kept house my husband and I had bought when our son was still in diapers. It wasn't a mansion, but it held a lifetime. Every wall had heard laughter. Every drawer held memories. I lived carefully, quietly, and I thought respectfully. I believed I had raised my son to value family, honesty, and patience. That belief was the first thing to crack. My health had slowed me down, but it hadn't taken me out. Arthritis made my mornings stiff, and my heart medication reminded me daily that I wasn't young anymore. But I cooked my own meals, paid my own bills, and still tended the small garden out back. When my son suggested that he and his wife move in for a little while, I told myself it was temporary. They said it would help them save money. They said it would help me not feel so alone. I said yes because I was a mother and because loneliness has a way of softening boundaries you once held firm. My daughter-in-law arrived with polite smiles and careful manners. She called me Mom almost immediately, which felt warm at first, like a compliment. She reorganized my kitchen without asking, but said it was to make things easier for me. She insisted on handling some of my appointments, saying I shouldn't stress. I noticed small things then, things I brushed aside. The way she asked about my finances too casually, the way she commented on my jewelry, lifting pieces as if weighing their value, the way she spoke about my house, not as a home, but as an asset. At night, I would lie awake listening to the house breathe differently with more people inside it. The floorboards creaked at unfamiliar hours. The fridge opened and closed long after I'd gone to bed. I told myself families adjusted. I told myself I was being sensitive. After all, she was my son's wife. I wanted peace more than I wanted to be right. The day everything changed was ordinary, too ordinary. I had gone to lie down in the afternoon because my chest felt tight and the medication made me drowsy. I wasn't asleep, not fully. I was in that soft space where you hear everything but feel invisible. Their voices drifted down the hallway, low and hushed, thinking I was resting. She spoke first, calm, practical, almost cheerful. She said my name like it belonged to a stranger. She said, "When it happens, we'll need to move fast." My son murmured something I couldn't quite hear. Then she said words that froze me in place. She talked about my funeral. She talked about cremation versus burial like she was choosing between curtains. She talked about who would get my rings, how much the house could sell for, and how my savings should be split. I remember staring at the ceiling fan, watching it turn slowly, wondering if my ears were lying to me. But then she laughed softly and said, "It's better to be prepared. She won't know anyway." That was the moment something inside me went very still. Not angry, not sad, just clear. They weren't talking about someday far away. They were talking about me like I was already gone. My son didn't stop her. He didn't defend me. He didn't say it was inappropriate. He asked questions. He listened. He agreed. That hurt more than anything she said, because betrayal from a stranger is easier to understand than silence from your own child. I waited until their voices faded before I sat up. My hands were shaking, but my mind was sharp. I walked to the bathroom, looked at my face in the mirror, and studied the woman staring back at me. I was older, yes, tired sometimes, but I was alive. And for the first time, I realized how dangerous it was that they had forgotten that. I didn't confront them. I didn't cry or accuse. I went back to the living room later and smiled when they asked how I was feeling. I thanked her for making soup. I asked my son about his day. Inside, I began counting. Counting days, counting conversations, counting every detail I had once ignored. That night, lying in bed, I understood something I had never fully grasped before. Kindness without boundaries invites entitlement, and silence, when used wisely, can be a form of protection. They believed they were planning the end of my life. What they didn't know was that I was about to take control of it in a way they would never expect. The morning after I overheard them, I woke up before dawn, not because I had slept well, but because my mind refused to rest. The house was quiet in that fragile way it only is before everyone else wakes. I lay there listening to my own breathing, steady and stubborn, and I remember thinking how strange it was that people could speak of your ending while your chest still rises and falls like this. I got out of bed slowly, careful not to wake my joints too abruptly, and padded into the kitchen. The kettle felt heavier than usual in my hands, or maybe I was just more aware of everything now. Awareness does that. It sharpens the world. As the water heated, I replayed their conversation over and over, not to torture myself, but to understand it. I needed to know if there had been hesitation in my son's voice, if there was a moment where he had sounded unsure. The more I replayed it, the clearer it became. He hadn't objected. He hadn't said my name with affection or concern. He had spoken like a man discussing logistics. That realization settled deeper than the rest. I had carried him for 9 months, taught him to tie his shoes, stayed up with him through fevers and nightmares, and now I was a future inconvenience to be managed. When they came into the kitchen later, I was already dressed, hair brushed, tea poured. I greeted them like any other morning. My daughter-in-law smiled brightly and asked if I'd slept well. I told her I had. It wasn't exactly a lie. Sleep implies rest, and while my body hadn't rested, my spirit had done something else entirely. It had decided to survive. Over breakfast, she spoke again about being helpful. She suggested gently that maybe we should start thinking about simplifying things around the house. Fewer possessions, less clutter. "You don't want to leave us with too much to sort through," she said with a soft laugh, as if it were a joke. I felt my son glance at me, searching my face. I kept it smooth. I nodded and said she was probably right. I watched relief flicker across her eyes. That relief told me everything I needed to know. They thought I was already handing over control. That day, after they left for work, I sat alone at the dining table with a notebook I hadn't used in years. I opened it slowly, like it might bite me, and I began to write. Not a diary entry, a list. Assets, accounts, documents, things I owned, and things I had assumed were safe simply because they were mine. I realized how dangerous assumptions could be when other people felt entitled to your life. I wrote down everything, even small things like the brooch my mother had given me and the old watch my husband wore every day. These weren't just objects, they were stories, and stories deserved protection. In the following weeks, I became observant in a way I hadn't been before. I noticed how my daughter-in-law hovered when the mail arrived, how she casually asked if I'd paid certain bills yet, how she reminded me more than once that I should really put things in order just in case. Each comment was delivered with a smile, wrapped in concern, but beneath it was impatience. I could feel it. She was waiting for something or someone to be gone. I started taking walks alone again, something I'd let slide since they moved in. I told them it helped my joints, which was true, but it also helped my thoughts. On one of those walks, I passed the small law office near the library, the one my husband and I had used years ago to update our will. I stopped without planning to. I stood there on the sidewalk, heart beating faster than it should, and realized that pretending ignorance didn't mean staying powerless. Silence was only useful if it was paired with action. Inside the office, the air smelled faintly of paper and old carpet. The lawyer who met with me was younger than I expected, kind-eyed and patient. I told him I wanted to review my estate plan. I didn't tell him about the whispers or the funeral plans. I simply said circumstances had changed. And they had. Over the next few appointments, we talked about trusts, about beneficiaries, about ensuring my wishes would be followed exactly as I intended. Every signature felt like reclaiming a small piece of myself. At home, I kept playing the part they expected. I accepted my daughter-in-law's offers to cook. I thanked her for organizing things. I let her believe she was easing her way into control. My son remained polite, distant in a way that hurt more than outright cruelty. Sometimes I caught him watching me, as if measuring how much time he had left. Those moments were the hardest. They made me question everything I thought I knew about love and loyalty. One evening, she brought up the topic again, more directly this time. She asked if I'd thought about what kind of service I might want someday. I looked at her and saw no malice in her expression, but calculation. I told her I hadn't decided yet, that there was still time. She smiled thinly and said, "Of course," but I could see the impatience behind her eyes, like someone tapping their foot while waiting in line. That night, alone in my room, I opened the notebook again, and I added another list, this one not about money or property, but about people. Who had shown up for me when my husband died? Who called without needing something? Who listened? The list was shorter than I expected. My son's name sat there, heavy and uncertain. I didn't cross it out, not yet, but I stopped protecting it. What surprised me most during those weeks wasn't the betrayal itself, but how calm I became once I accepted it. Denial had been exhausting. Acceptance gave me clarity. I stopped hoping they would change and started planning as if they wouldn't. There is a strange freedom in letting go of expectations. It allows you to see people as they are, not as you wish them to be. By the time my daughter-in-law began talking openly about downsizing and selling the house eventually, I was already steps ahead of her. She thought she was guiding me toward an ending she had written. What she didn't know is that I had picked up the pen myself, and I wasn't finished writing.
There's a certain quiet that settles over you once you stop expecting fairness. It's not peaceful at first. It's more like numbness, a protective layer that keeps the hurt from cutting too deep while you figure out how to stand again. That was the quiet I lived in as weeks passed. My daughter-in-law grew more confident, more open with her suggestions, and my son followed her lead like a man who had decided it was easier not to think for himself. I watched them the way you watch strangers on a train, curious but detached, no longer assuming we shared the same destination. One afternoon, while my son was at work and my daughter-in-law was in the shower, I heard her phone buzzing on the kitchen counter. I wasn't trying to snoop, I truly wasn't, but the screen lit up with a message preview that made my stomach drop. It was from someone saved as Lydia, and it read, "Did you get the appraisal yet?" I stood there staring at those words, feeling the room tilt slightly. Appraisal. Not someday, not hypothetically, already in motion. I didn't touch the phone. I didn't read further. I didn't need to. The message confirmed what I had already suspected. They weren't just planning, they were preparing. I walked back to my room and sat on the edge of the bed until my breathing steadied. Then I did something I hadn't done in years. I called my older sister. We hadn't been especially close since she moved out of state, but she was honest in a way few people were. She listened without interrupting as I told her everything, the whispers, the funeral plans, the appraisal message. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You don't owe them your life just because you gave birth to him." Hearing that from someone else made it real in a way my own thoughts hadn't. She reminded me that love didn't require self-erasure, that being a mother didn't mean being disposable. After that call, I made a decision that scared me more than confronting them ever could have. I began quietly separating my life from theirs. I opened a new bank account in my own name, one they knew nothing about, and redirected my pension payments. I gathered important documents and placed them in a safety deposit box. Each step felt both terrifying and empowering, like learning to walk again after a fall. I told myself I was doing this not out of spite, but out of self-respect. I needed to believe that. At home, the atmosphere shifted. My daughter-in-law noticed changes before my son did. She asked why I was going out more often. I told her I was trying to stay active. She asked if I was feeling unwell. I told her I felt fine. She asked if I'd spoken to a lawyer recently, her voice too casual. I smiled and said no. The lie tasted bitter but necessary. She watched me closely after that, like a cat sensing movement behind a closed door. One evening, I overheard another conversation, though this one wasn't as shocking. It was angry. She was frustrated that things weren't moving faster. She said something about me being stubbornly healthy, and my son laughed uncomfortably. That laugh hurt in a way I hadn't anticipated. It told me he had accepted her narrative of me as an obstacle rather than a person. In that moment, I grieved not just the betrayal, but the son I thought I had. Despite everything, there were moments of doubt. Late at night, I would wonder if I was overreacting, if maybe I'd misunderstood, if maybe this was just concern twisted by poor wording. But then I would remember the calm way she spoke of dividing my belongings, and the doubt would fade. Concern doesn't sound like that. Love doesn't rush endings. The lawyer called me one afternoon to tell me the trust documents were nearly finalized. He explained everything carefully, making sure I understood each decision. As he spoke, I felt something unexpected rise in my chest. Pride. Not the loud kind, but the quiet kind that comes from protecting yourself after years of putting others first. I had chosen beneficiaries who had shown kindness, not entitlement. I had set conditions that ensured my wishes would be respected. I had ensured that my son would not be cut off entirely, but that access would be limited and protected. It was a balance between justice and mercy, and it took everything in me to strike it. When I returned home that day, my daughter-in-law was in the living room sorting through old photo albums. She looked up and smiled, holding one up. She said, "We should digitize these. They'll be easier to share later." The word later hung in the air between us. I nodded and sat down, flipping through pages filled with faces frozen in time. My husband's smile, my son as a child. moments that belonged to me, not to anyone planning to profit from them. As she chatted about organizing and efficiency, I realized something important. She thought control came from proximity, from living under the same roof, from managing daily details. But real control comes from knowledge, from preparation, from knowing when to speak and when to stay silent. And I had that now. I began to imagine the moment when the truth would surface, not as a confrontation fueled with anger, but as a revelation delivered calmly, firmly, and on my terms. I didn't know exactly how or when it would happen yet, but I knew this much. I would not be rushed into my own ending. I would not be buried under other people's expectations. And when the time came, they would learn that planning someone's funeral while they're still alive is a dangerous thing to do, because the living still have choices.
Once you accept that someone is waiting for your absence, the world sharpens around you in uncomfortable ways. Every kindness feels rehearsed. Every question sounds like a calculation. I began to notice how my daughter-in-law watched me when I climbed the stairs, how her eyes lingered when I rubbed my chest or paused to catch my breath. It wasn't concern, it was assessment. I stopped sharing details about my health. I answered questions with half smiles and generalities. Privacy, I learned, was a form of armor. My son, on the other hand, grew quieter. He avoided long conversations with me, as if proximity might force him to acknowledge something he didn't want to face. Sometimes when we were alone in the kitchen, I would catch him studying me with an expression I couldn't name. Guilt, maybe, or fear. He never asked how I was feeling beyond the surface level. He never asked if I was happy. That silence spoke louder than any words. I started spending more time in my garden, not because it needed me, but because it reminded me that life continues at its own pace. Plants don't rush their seasons. They don't bloom because someone else wants them to. They grow when they're ready. Kneeling in the soil, feeling the earth under my fingers, grounded me. It reminded me that I was still here, still capable, still deserving of respect. One afternoon, my daughter-in-law joined me outside. She brought lemonade and sat across from me, watching as I trimmed dead leaves from a rose bush. After a few minutes of small talk, she sighed and said she'd been thinking a lot about the future. I didn't look up. I let her speak. She talked about stability, about how unpredictable life could be, about wanting to make sure everything was in place for everyone's sake. Her words were smooth, practiced. She never mentioned love or loss, only logistics. When she finally paused, I wiped my hands on my gardening apron and met her eyes. I told her I believed the future was something people should approach with humility, that planning was wise, but assuming outcomes was dangerous. She smiled politely, but her eyes hardened. In that moment, I knew she understood that I wasn't as passive as she'd hoped. The mask slipped just enough for me to see the frustration underneath. That evening, I overheard an argument between her and my son. She accused him of being weak, of letting me run the show. He responded defensively, saying I was his mother, that things needed to be handled delicately. She snapped back that delicacy didn't pay bills or secure inheritances. Hearing the word inheritance spoken so openly made my hands shake. They weren't even pretending anymore, at least not with each other. I retreated to my room and sat on the bed, heart pounding. Part of me wanted to march into the living room and demand answers, to ask my son when I had stopped being his mother and started being his burden. But I didn't. I reminded myself of my plan, of the work already done. Confrontation without leverage would only give them time to adjust. Silence, paired with preparation, was still my best option.
A few days later, my lawyer called to let me know everything was finalized. The trust was set, the protections were in place. All that remained was to sign one last document and store copies securely. As I held the pen in his office, my hand trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of what I was doing. This was more than paperwork. This was me choosing myself after a lifetime of choosing others. When I returned home that day, my daughter-in-law was unusually attentive. She offered to help me up the stairs, asked if I needed anything, insisted I rest. The sudden concern felt almost comical. I realized she must have sensed a shift, even if she didn't understand it. People like her are attuned to control slipping through their fingers. They feel it before they see it. That night, lying in bed, I thought about legacy, not money or property, but impact, the kind of person I wanted to be remembered as. I didn't want my final chapter to be one of bitterness or revenge. I wanted it to be about dignity, about standing quietly, firmly, and leaving behind a lesson they would never forget. The next morning, I made a decision that would change the dynamic entirely. I told them I was thinking of taking a short trip to visit my sister, just a week or two, I said, a change of scenery. My daughter-in-law's reaction was immediate and poorly disguised. She asked if I was feeling well enough to travel, if it was really necessary. My son looked relieved, as if distance might ease his discomfort. I smiled and told them not to worry. I had everything handled. And as I packed my suitcase that afternoon, I realized something important. Sometimes stepping away isn't running. Sometimes it's creating space for the truth to surface. And when I came back, I wouldn't just be a woman they were waiting to lose. I would be someone they had seriously underestimated. Leaving the house, even temporarily, felt like stepping out of a fog. As my sister's car pulled away from the curb, I watched my front door grow smaller in the distance and felt a strange mix of grief and relief. That house had been my anchor for decades, yet it had slowly turned into a place where I was being measured, managed, and quietly written out. Sitting in the passenger seat, I rested my hands in my lap and reminded myself that this break wasn't abandonment, it was perspective. My sister's home was louder than mine had been in years. Wind chimes on the porch, a radio humming softly in the kitchen, neighbors who waved and actually stopped to talk. She treated me like a person, not a project. She asked how I was feeling and waited for a real answer. At night, we sat at her dining table with cups of tea, and I told her more details I'd kept tucked away. Each time I spoke, the story felt less heavy. Saying things out loud has a way of exposing truths you can't ignore anymore. During that week, I slept better than I had in months, not because the situation was resolved, but because I wasn't constantly bracing myself. I took walks, visited the library, and even laughed at things that surprised me. Life had quietly gone on while I was stuck inside my own house, shrinking myself to keep peace. Being away reminded me that peace built on fear isn't peace at all. Meanwhile, my phone buzzed more than usual. My daughter-in-law checked in almost daily, her messages overly sweet, filled with concern. She asked what I was eating, whether I was taking my medication, when I planned to return. My son's messages were shorter, less frequent. He asked if I was okay. He didn't ask if I was enjoying myself. The contrast told me more than either of them realized. Midway through the week, my sister asked me a question I hadn't allowed myself to consider yet. She asked what I would do if my son confronted me once the truth came out. The question sat between us like a fragile object. I told her I didn't know. Part of me still hoped he would see the situation clearly, that he would recognize how wrong it was to discuss my death like a financial opportunity. Another part of me understood that hope doesn't change people who are comfortable benefiting from silence. Before I left, my sister hugged me tightly and told me she was proud of me. That word proud landed in my chest with unexpected force.
I hadn't realized how rarely I heard it anymore. As we drove back to my house, I felt steadier, more resolved. I wasn't returning as the same woman who had left. I was returning with clarity. The house felt different when I walked in, not because anything had changed physically, but because I had. My daughter-in-law greeted me enthusiastically, commenting on how good I looked, how refreshed. My son smiled, but his eyes darted away quickly, like he wasn't quite ready to meet mine. I thanked them for holding down the fort and went to my room to unpack. As I folded my clothes, I noticed my desk drawer had been slightly disturbed, not enough to be obvious, just enough to be noticeable if you were paying attention. I smiled to myself. Curiosity had gotten the better of her. Over the next few days, I watched carefully. My daughter-in-law seemed restless, pacing more, checking her phone often. She brought up the subject of paperwork again, suggesting it might be easier if she helped organize my documents so nothing gets lost. I declined politely, telling her I had everything under control. The disappointment on her face was quick but unmistakable. Then came the dinner that changed everything. It was a quiet evening, nothing special. She had cooked one of my son's favorite meals, a gesture meant to create warmth and normalcy. Halfway through the meal, she casually mentioned that she'd spoken to a friend who worked in real estate. She talked about how the market was strong, how properties like mine were selling fast. She said it might be wise to think about selling sooner rather than later, especially given my age. She said it kindly, but the implication was sharp. I put my fork down slowly and looked at her. I asked her why she was in such a hurry. The question caught her off guard. She stumbled for a moment before saying she just wanted to make sure everyone was secure. I asked her what she meant by everyone. She glanced at my son, then back at me, and said, "the family." The way she said it excluded me without even trying. That night, after they went to bed, I sat alone in the living room and made another decision. I would stop waiting for the perfect moment. The perfect moment doesn't exist when people are already writing your ending. I wasn't going to confront them in anger or accuse them in the heat of emotion. I would tell the truth calmly, clearly, and with evidence they couldn't dismiss. The next morning, I called my lawyer and asked him to prepare copies of the trust documents. I also called my bank to confirm everything was secure. Each call steadied me. When I hung up, I looked around the house, at the furniture my husband and I chose together, at the photos lining the hallway. This place had seen grief, joy, struggle, and growth. It would not see me diminished. I asked my son and daughter-in-law to sit down with me that evening. I told them I had something important to discuss. My daughter-in-law's smile tightened, and my son looked anxious. As they sat across from me, I realized this was the moment they had been waiting for, though not in the way they expected. They thought I was about to hand over control. They had no idea I was about to take it back. When they sat down across from me, I noticed how differently they carried themselves. My daughter-in-law leaned forward slightly, hands folded, eyes alert. My son sat back, shoulders tense, like a child waiting to be scolded. I had imagined this moment so many times that it almost felt rehearsed, but the truth was, no amount of preparation could soften the weight of what I was about to do. Still, my voice didn't shake when I began. That alone surprised me. I told them I wanted to talk about the future. I watched my daughter-in-law's eyes flicker with anticipation. I spoke slowly, choosing my words carefully, not to protect them, but to protect myself. I told them I had been thinking a lot about independence, about dignity, about how important it was to feel respected in your own home. My son nodded along, relief washing over his face, as if he believed this conversation was going exactly where he wanted it to go. Then I paused. I let the silence stretch just long enough to make them uncomfortable. I told them I knew.
I didn't say how or when. I simply said I knew about the conversations, about the plans, about the assumptions that had been made while I was still very much alive. The room went still. My daughter-in-law's smile vanished. My son's face drained of color. She recovered first, of course. She laughed softly and said I must have misunderstood, that people sometimes talk hypothetically, that she would never mean any harm. I listened without interrupting, the way you listen when you already know the truth. When she finished, I asked her one simple question. I asked her why she had discussed dividing my belongings before discussing my wishes with me. She didn't answer. She looked at my son. That was when he spoke. His voice was quiet, strained. He said they were only trying to be prepared. He said they loved me. He said they didn't think I would hear. That last sentence told me everything. Love doesn't rely on secrecy. Preparation doesn't require erasing the person involved. I told them about the appraisal message. I told them about the comments, the impatience, the way my health had been treated like a countdown. My daughter-in-law's composure cracked then. She said she felt attacked. She said she had only wanted stability. She said I was being dramatic. The word hung between us, sharp and dismissive. I realized then that no explanation I offered would ever satisfy her, because acknowledging my pain would mean acknowledging her greed. I reached into the folder on the table beside me and pulled out the documents. I didn't slide them across the table. I held them in my hands. I told them I had updated my estate plan. I told them everything was in order, legally and securely. I told them my wishes were clear and protected. My daughter-in-law's eyes widened, and for the first time I saw fear there. Not concern, fear of losing control. My son asked what it meant for them. The question was quiet, but it cut deeply. Not what it meant for me, for them. I told him it meant he would still be my son, but that access to my life would no longer come at the expense of my dignity. I told them that my finances, my property, and my decisions were no longer open for discussion. I told them I would not be hurried to an ending I didn't choose. My daughter-in-law stood up abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. She accused me of not trusting her. She said she had sacrificed by moving in, by helping. I listened, then told her calmly that help given with expectation isn't help, it's leverage. The words surprised even me, but once spoken, they felt right. My son remained seated, staring at the table. I asked him if he had anything he wanted to say. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he said he was sorry. The apology was soft, incomplete, and long overdue. I accepted it for what it was, not as closure, but as acknowledgement. That was all I needed from him in that moment. I told them living together was no longer working, that I would be making changes. I didn't specify what those changes would be yet. I wanted them to sit with the uncertainty for a while. My daughter-in-law looked at my son, then back at me, her jaw tight. She asked where they were supposed to go. I told her that was for them to decide. That night, after they retreated to their room, I sat alone and let the weight of the conversation settle. I felt drained, but lighter, like I had finally set down a heavy load I'd been carrying alone. I knew this wasn't the end of the conflict. It was the beginning of a shift. People who feel entitled don't let go easily. Over the next few days, the house grew tense. My daughter-in-law avoided me entirely. My son tried, awkwardly, to make small talk, but the ease we once had was gone. And yet, beneath the discomfort, I felt something new. Control. not over them, but over myself. One morning, as I sipped my tea by the window, I realized something important. They had planned my funeral because they thought my story was ending. What they hadn't understood was that this was only the turning point, and from here on out, every chapter would be written with intention. After that conversation, the house felt like a place holding its breath. Doors closed more softly, footsteps hesitated in hallways, and even the air seemed careful. My daughter-in-law no longer pretended to be pleasant. The smiles were gone, replaced by cold efficiency. She cooked for herself and my son, cleaned only their spaces, and spoke to me only when absolutely necessary. The warmth she had once performed vanished the moment she realized she no longer controlled the outcome. My son hovered between us, uncomfortable and unsure. He tried to bridge the gap with half-hearted attempts at normalcy, asking if I needed groceries or help with errands. I thanked him, but I didn't invite him back into my inner world. Trust, once cracked, doesn't return just because someone says sorry. It returns slowly, if at all, through consistency, and I needed time to see who he was without her directing the narrative. One afternoon, I overheard my daughter-in-law on the phone. She was angry, pacing the living room, her voice sharp and unguarded. She complained about how unfair the situation was, how she had counted on things, how I was being selfish. Hearing myself described that way stung less than I expected. It confirmed what I already knew. In her story, I was never meant to be a person, I was a resource. A few days later, she confronted me directly. It was sudden, unplanned, and raw. She accused me of manipulating my son, of turning him against her. She said I was punishing her for being practical. I listened quietly, letting her unload everything she had been holding back. When she finished, breathing hard, I told her something she wasn't prepared to hear. I told her I wasn't punishing her, I was protecting myself, and I told her that if she couldn't respect that, then living under my roof was no longer an option. The words landed heavily between us. She stared at me, disbelief written across her face. For the first time, she looked truly uncertain. She stormed off to their room, slamming the door behind her. That night, I heard them arguing again, voices raised, tension spilling into the hallway. This time, I didn't retreat. I sat in my room and listened, not because I wanted to eavesdrop, but because I no longer felt the need to hide from the truth. 2 weeks later, my son told me they would be moving out. He said it carefully, as if bracing for an outburst. I nodded and told him I thought it was for the best. He looked surprised, maybe even relieved. He said they would need some time to find a place. I told them they could have 30 days. The boundary felt solid, fair, and final. During those 30 days, I reclaimed my home piece by piece. I rearranged furniture. I brought out items I had packed away to make space for them. I played music again, softly at first, then louder. My daughter-in-law moved through the house like a guest, counting down the hours. She avoided eye contact, avoided conversation. My son spent more time out, perhaps trying to escape the tension, perhaps trying to think. The last night before they left, my son knocked on my door. He looked tired, older than his years. He told me he was confused, that he hadn't realized how far things had gone until it was too late. I listened, then told him something I had learned the hard way. Love doesn't mean surrendering your judgment, and marriage doesn't excuse forgetting where you came from. He nodded, tears in his eyes, and said he hoped we could rebuild. I told him I hoped so too, but rebuilding takes time and honesty. When they left the next morning, the house felt empty in a way that wasn't sad. It was spacious, quiet, mine again. I stood in the doorway and watched their car disappear down the street, feeling a mix of grief for what was lost and relief for what remained. I closed the door gently and leaned against it, letting the silence wash over me. In the weeks that followed, I focused on myself. I attended appointments without commentary. I met friends for coffee. I volunteered at the local library. Slowly, my life filled with things that had nothing to do with inheritance or expectations. People saw me again, not as someone nearing an end, but as someone still living. One afternoon, I received a message from my daughter-in-law. It was brief, curt, and laced with resentment. She said she hoped I was happy. I didn't respond. Happiness, I had learned, doesn't need to be justified to those who wanted you gone. As time passed, my son called more often. Our conversations were cautious but sincere. He began to speak for himself again rather than echoing her words. I didn't rush forgiveness. I let it grow naturally, like everything else that lasts. Looking back, I realized that the moment they planned my funeral wasn't the end of my story. It was the moment I stopped letting others write it for me. And in doing so, I discovered a strength I didn't know I still had.
Life after they moved out unfolded quietly, almost gently, like a house settling after a storm. At first, I didn't trust the calm. I kept expecting another shoe to drop, another demand, another attempt to pull me back into a role I had already shed. But days passed, then weeks, and nothing happened. The silence wasn't empty this time. It was restorative. I began small rituals for myself. Morning walks without explanation, breakfast at the table instead of standing at the counter, evenings with a book instead of the television murmuring for company. These weren't dramatic changes, but they felt revolutionary. For the first time in a long while, my days belonged to me alone. My son called regularly. At first, our conversations stayed safe. Weather, work, mundane details that didn't risk reopening wounds. Slowly, he began asking real questions. How was my health? Was I lonely? Did I need anything? I answered honestly but carefully. I didn't punish him with silence, but I also didn't rush to reassure him that everything was fine. Some lessons need to sit with you before they take hold. One afternoon, he asked if he could stop by. He said he wanted to talk, just the two of us. I agreed. When he arrived, he looked nervous, like a boy again. We sat in the living room, the same space where so many unspoken things had hung in the air before. He took a deep breath and apologized properly this time. Not just for the funeral talk, but for allowing someone else's greed to drown out his loyalty. He admitted he'd been afraid of conflict, afraid of choosing sides, and ended up choosing the wrong one by doing nothing. I listened, my hands folded in my lap. When he finished, I told him forgiveness wasn't a switch you flipped. It was a process. I told him I loved him, but that love didn't erase accountability. He nodded, accepting that. For the first time in a long while, I saw sincerity in his eyes. It didn't heal everything, but it opened a door. My daughter-in-law, on the other hand, remained distant. I heard through mutual acquaintances that she was angry, that she felt wronged. I wasn't surprised. People who see relationships as transactions struggle when the terms change. I didn't engage in gossip or defense. I simply lived. One day, I decided to host a small gathering. Nothing elaborate, just a few friends and neighbors for tea and conversation. As we sat laughing and sharing stories, I realized how much I had shrunk myself during those months of tension. I had been careful, quiet, accommodating to the point of invisibility. Being surrounded by people who valued me for who I was, not what I owned, reminded me of my worth. That evening, after everyone left, I walked through my home slowly. I touched the backs of chairs, the frames of photographs, the familiar corners. This house had been the center of a power struggle I never asked for. Now it felt like a sanctuary again.
I understood then that legacy isn't about what you leave behind, but how you live while you're still here. A few weeks later, I received a letter from my lawyer confirming that everything was secure and up to date. I filed it away with a sense of finality, not because I was thinking about the end, but because I had learned the value of preparation done with intention, not fear. My health remained steady. Some days were harder than others, but they always had been. The difference now was that I faced them without the added weight of being watched, measured, and counted down. I was allowed to have bad days without them meaning anything more than that. One afternoon, as I sat in the garden trimming roses, I thought about the moment I overheard those whispers. How small and fragile I had felt then, how powerless. And I smiled, not because it no longer hurt, but because I had grown past it. Betrayal had forced me to confront truths I had long avoided, but it had also given me clarity. It showed me who I was when tested. When my son left that evening after another visit, he hugged me a little longer than usual. He told me he was proud of me. The words echoed something my sister had said months before. This time, they didn't surprise me. I had learned to be proud of myself. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the yard, I felt a deep sense of closure, not because everything was perfect, but because I was no longer afraid. They had planned my funeral while I was still alive. In doing so, they had awakened something in me, a refusal to be erased, a determination to live fully, loudly if I chose, and on my own terms.
Time has a way of smoothing the sharpest edges, but it doesn't erase the memory of where the cuts came from. Months passed and life settled into a rhythm that felt earned rather than imposed. I noticed how differently I carried myself now. I stood straighter. I spoke without apologizing. I no longer explained my choices as if they needed approval. These were small shifts, but together they changed everything. My relationship with my son continued to evolve. We met for coffee occasionally, just the two of us. At first, there was an awkwardness to those meetings, as if we were relearning how to be mother and son. Slowly, the ease returned, not the blind trust of before, but something more grounded. He began to talk about his marriage in ways he never had. He admitted that things were strained, that resentment had settled in where entitlement once lived. I listened without judgment. His marriage was his lesson to learn, not mine to fix. One afternoon, he told me they were going to counseling. I felt a mix of emotions at that. Hope, mostly, but also a sense of distance. I told him I was glad he was taking responsibility for his life. He asked if I thought it would help. I told him honesty always helps, even when it hurts. The answer seemed to comfort him. I saw my daughter-in-law only once during that time, at a family gathering hosted by a relative. The room felt charged the moment we were within sight of each other. She greeted me politely, stiffly, and kept her distance. I returned the courtesy and focused my attention elsewhere. There was no satisfaction in her discomfort, only confirmation. She no longer held power over my emotions, and that was enough. Later that evening, a cousin pulled me aside and asked quietly if everything was all right. I smiled and told her yes, and it was true. I didn't owe anyone an explanation for boundaries they hadn't had to fight for. Back at home, I began to think about what I wanted to do with the time I had, not in terms of years left, but in terms of days lived well. I signed up for a writing class at the community center. I volunteered twice a week. I reconnected with friends I had drifted from. Each choice felt like a statement. I am still here. I still matter. One evening, as I sorted through old photographs, I came across a picture of my husband and me from our early years. We were young, laughing, unaware of all that life would ask of us. I realized then that the life we built together had always been about resilience, about facing hardship with grace. He would have been proud of how I handled this, not with bitterness, but with resolve. My son called me one night, his voice heavy. He said he and his wife were separating, at least for now. He didn't ask for advice. He didn't ask me to take sides. He simply shared the news. I told him I was sorry he was hurting and that I hoped he found clarity. When we hung up, I sat quietly for a long time. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt sad. Sad for him. Sad for what could have been if greed hadn't been allowed to take root. A few weeks later, he came by alone. He looked exhausted, but lighter somehow. He thanked me for not turning away from him, even when he had failed me. I told him accountability and love can exist together. One doesn't cancel out the other. He nodded, tears welling in his eyes. That night, after he left, I walked through my home once more, as I had done so many times before, but this time the feeling was different. There was no tension, no anticipation of conflict, just a quiet satisfaction. I had faced betrayal not by becoming harder, but by becoming clearer. People often think revenge looks like triumph, like watching someone else fall. But real justice, I've learned, looks like freedom. It looks like sleeping well. It looks like living without fear of being diminished. They had planned my funeral while I was still alive, and in doing so, they had given me the greatest gift of all, a reason to reclaim my life fully. As another year turned, I found myself reflecting not on what I had lost, but on what I had gained. The house, once heavy with unspoken tension, felt like a place of renewal. Sunlight seemed to linger longer in the rooms. The air felt lighter, as if the walls themselves had exhaled. I realized that spaces absorb emotion, and now mine was finally free. My health remained a steady companion, sometimes demanding attention, sometimes allowing me to forget about it altogether. But the fear that had once hovered around every ache was gone. I no longer saw myself through the lens of other people's expectations of my ending. I saw myself as I was, a woman still living, still choosing, still capable of growth. My son and I continued rebuilding our relationship, carefully and honestly. We spoke more openly than we ever had before. He told me about the things he had ignored, the moments he wished he could undo. I listened without lecturing. I had learned that the most powerful lessons aren't delivered through blame, but through example. By standing up for myself, I had shown him what self-respect looked like. Whether he carried that forward was up to him. One afternoon, I made a decision that felt symbolic. I revised my will one last time, not to change beneficiaries, but to include a letter, a personal message to be read after I'm gone. Not to shame or scold, but to explain, to tell my story in my own words, to remind those left behind that I had lived with intention, not fear. Writing that letter felt like sealing a chapter, knowing it would be opened only when the time was right. I didn't hear from my daughter-in-law again. Through the quiet, I learned something important. Closure doesn't always come with apologies or understanding. Sometimes it comes with distance, and that distance can be a gift. On my birthday, I hosted a small celebration. Nothing grand, just a handful of people who had walked beside me through different seasons of my life. As we laughed and shared cake, I looked around the room and felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. These were the people who saw me, not my assets, who valued my presence, not my absence.
Later that evening, as I cleaned up, my son stayed behind to help. As we washed dishes side by side, he thanked me again, not just for forgiveness, but for strength. He said watching me stand my ground had changed how he saw everything. I told him change often comes from discomfort and that growth is rarely convenient. He smiled, understanding more than he used to. That night, I sat by the window, watching the streetlights flicker on one by one. I thought about the woman I had been when I overheard those whispers, afraid, uncertain, quiet. And I thought about who I was now, steady, clear, unafraid to take up space. If there's one lesson I carry forward, it's this. You don't have to be loud to be powerful. You don't have to be cruel to be strong. And you don't have to disappear to keep the peace. Peace that costs you your dignity is too expensive. They planned my funeral while I was still alive, but what they didn't plan for was my resilience, my voice, my refusal to be erased. And because of that, I am living more fully now than I ever have before. There is a strange clarity that comes when you realize your story is no longer being written by fear. I woke up one morning, not long after everything had settled, and felt something I hadn't felt in years. Lightness. Not happiness exactly, but freedom, the kind that comes when you're no longer bracing yourself for disappointment. I began spending my mornings differently. I stopped rushing. I sat on the porch with my tea and let the day come to me instead of chasing it. Neighbors waved. Birds argued loudly in the trees. Life continued, simple and unbothered, and for the first time in a long while, I felt aligned with it. My son visited more often, not out of obligation, but intention. I could tell the difference. He listened now, really listened. He asked about my memories, my childhood, my regrets, my joys, things he'd never thought to ask before. And I realized that sometimes betrayal cracks something open, not just breaks it. Through that crack, honesty can finally enter. We spoke once about his wife, not in anger, but in reflection. He admitted that love had made him blind, and fear had kept him quiet. I didn't defend her, and I didn't attack her either. I simply told him this. Love that asks you to shrink someone else is not love. It's control wearing a softer face. He nodded slowly, like a man finally recognizing a language he'd been speaking fluently without understanding. I never saw her again, and I made peace with that. I stopped wondering what she told people or how she justified herself. That curiosity faded when I understood something important. My life did not require her understanding to be complete. Silence in this case was not absence, it was protection. I poured my energy into things that had waited patiently for me. Old hobbies, letters to friends I'd neglected, small acts of generosity done quietly, without announcement. I volunteered at a local community center, helping other women navigate finances and legal paperwork. Women who had been told they were too old, too emotional, or too late. When they looked at me with relief in their eyes, I saw my past self reflected back, and I spoke gently because I knew how fragile that moment of awakening can be. One afternoon, a woman asked me how I found the courage to stand up for myself. I told her the truth. I didn't, not at first. Courage didn't arrive before the action, it came after. It came when I realized the cost of silence was greater than the cost of conflict, when I realized that being agreeable was slowly erasing me. That night, I reread the letter I had written for after my passing. I didn't change a word. It wasn't a letter of bitterness. It was a letter of truth. It spoke of love freely given, boundaries learned late but honored fiercely, and forgiveness that didn't require reconciliation. I sealed it again, satisfied.
As the months passed, my health had its ups and downs, but my spirit stayed steady. Doctors spoke in cautious tones, but I no longer flinched at uncertainty. Death, I had learned, is not the enemy. Being treated as if you're already gone is. On another quiet evening, I stood in my bedroom and looked around at the familiar walls. This was the place they had already emptied in their minds, the place they had imagined without me. And yet here I was, breathing, living, choosing. There was something deeply satisfying about that. I thought about legacy, not in terms of money or belongings, but impact. The example I set, the strength my son witnessed, the women I helped, the peace I reclaimed. That, I realized, was the inheritance that mattered most. If someone listening to my story is standing at the edge of their own quiet betrayal, unsure whether to speak, unsure whether it's worth the trouble, let me say this gently. You are not selfish for protecting what you worked for. You are not dramatic for demanding respect. And you are not wrong for wanting to live fully right up until your very last breath. They planned my funeral while I was still alive. They divided my things, counted my savings, and whispered about my ending. What they didn't account for was my awakening, and that made all the difference. I am still here, still standing, still writing my story, and no one gets to decide the ending but me.